Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. We're about to start. Just hang tight for another minute. And if you'd like, help us spread the word by sharing this live stream. That would be much appreciated. One more thing I gotta do.
David, I feel like you should share some seafaring yarns with us.
No, that's. I got home. I was wearing my little cap earlier. Saw myself in the mirror. Started singing "What Do You Do with the Drunken Sailor." So I'll try to avoid doing that tonight, though.
Okay, I think we're good. So we can go ahead and get started before any other things start happening on this live stream. But hopefully you folks are able to tune in from home and you're able to hear us and see us. We're going to have a really good conversation today. Paul, hopefully you can hear us now. I hear that you're asking about audio, but hopefully the sound is coming through. But my name is Adam Shimoni, and I am so excited to be hosting today's conversation, this educational conversation about the history of bicycle planning locally here in Flagstaff, but also tying some of those points to state efforts and initiatives, which we're very fortunate to have my friend Sam Meyer with us, who is an archivist for the Discovery at NAU Klein's Library. And Sam's going to be going through a lot of this history for us. But this is such an important conversation to take a minute to learn about the past and the history and learn about the efforts that have been done before us to better understand how to move forward with clarity today and build upon the past, but also learn from the past, the good and the bad. So very excited about this conversation. We've got a great group of folks on this call with me today. And hold on, I'm just looking at the comments. Looks like there's some issues on YouTube, and I'm not too sure why, but I think we're just going to have to keep going. And for now, so basically, we have Sam Meyer, who is currently serving as the archivist for Discovery at NAU Klein's Library Special Collections and Archives, where she rides her bike to work every day, unless it's snowing. Sam, do you want to say hi and speak a little bit about your position and your interest in these topics?
Sure. Good evening. I'm Sam. My position at NAU, and before I say anything else, I should say that any opinions I may offer today are mine and not those of my employer. But my position at NAU as Archivist for Discovery is to help researchers find and utilize the unique resources we have here in Klein Library Special Collections and Archives for whatever kinds of projects they may choose. Bicycling is a personal interest of mine since I am a bicyclist, and I'm also a child of Flagstaff. I grew up here before leaving for college and then library school, and have returned so that I can serve the community that gave so much to me by sharing little pieces of our history back to that community. So I'm excited to be here, and that's all I have to say for myself right now.
Sam, that's great. And this whole conversation for tonight really sparked from a conversation I had with Sam, where she started telling me about the history and her work. And as she was going through the decades, I thought to myself, we got to do this live. We got to do this for the community, and it's just too good. So Sam, thank you for your work, and thank you for being here with us this evening. Susan is with us, and Susan's been a bike commuter since she was 5 years old. She's been on the boards of FBO, Flagstaff Biking Organization, and the Flagstaff Cycling Club, and joined the Flagstaff Biking Advisory Committee for the city in 2016, chairing meetings since 2020. Susan, welcome. Is your mic working?
I do not think so. Yes. It is.
It is.
All right. Yay.
Good job.
I hope I don't
Susan,
have to type on my
you
phone.
want to say a couple words about yourself and what's your interest in all this?
Well, I'm the chair for the Flagstaff Bike Advisory Commission, and we've been working a long time to tedious detail to bring the master plan, and I hope everyone supports it or lends their voice, and so we can make it implemented and functional.
That's great.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Susan, for being with us. Next, we have Nat. Nat White was our former vice mayor back in the early 90s. Nat, you have to correct me. You have to let me know when you began your term. But Nat also served as the Bikeway Committee representative in 1991 in that planning process that occurred back then. Nat, welcome. You want to take a minute to introduce yourself and speak about your role in all these historic documents that we're going to be talking about today? And your mic is muted. Let me see. I think I can unmute you. Oh,
I
no,
did
I
it.
can't.
I did
There
it.
you go.
Thank you, Adam. First, I think what I can contribute is I've lived here for over half a century, and I've seen the town as a very small town where somebody running on the street was weird, and bikes were not that prevalent to a time starting around early 80s when mountain biking and other types of riding began to become popular to the point, I don't think that's my crackling, to the point where the Foots Trail came into existence, and then with various leaders, and currently Martin Ince, in terms of actually making it a practical way of transportation. So it's really covered the gamut. So that's that. In fact, that's my observation of the 50 years, from nothing to, oh, wouldn't this be something where most of the community said, well, I'm not so sure as I want a trail near my yard or anything like that, to a point where it's accepted. And it's just a matter of planning and strategy and organizing.
Right. That's great. Thank you, Nat. Thank you for being with us this evening. Next, I'd like to introduce Martin Ince, who is the Multimodal Transportation Planner at the City of Flagstaff. Martin, thanks for being with us. Take a minute and introduce yourself and some of your history with the city and these types of planning efforts.
Thanks, Adam. I've been with the city since 1997. I've been in my current role since about 2006. But some of my responsibilities include planning for pedestrian and bicycle accommodation, as well as planning for the Foots system. So we're here tonight talking about some of the history of bike planning in Flagstaff. But I think it's nice that we'll close it with kind of the future of bike planning in Flagstaff, and we're working on the next version of that, and hope to make that a reality. On a personal level, I've ridden a bike for more years than I care to admit to publicly. It's been almost 25 years since I've driven a car to work. So I find that other options work pretty well, especially in a place like Flagstaff. And I've been acquainted with Nat for a long time. I've read through all the documents, some of the previous plans that Flagstaff has adopted for biking in the Foots Trails, and I just find this fascinating. I think that as we move forward, it's really important for us to kind of do honor, look backwards and make sure that we recognize that we're part of a continuum, that we're just moving this forward. We're not starting anything new. This has already been going on. And thanks for having me.
Well said, and thank you for being with us, Martin, and all of your leadership and work at the city. We appreciate it, and I like how you said that, a continuum. And last but not least, we have David Wessel with us, who is a manager at the Flagstaff Metropolitan Planning Organization. David, welcome. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. This is really exciting topic, exciting panel. I work for this kind of obscure organization, a metropolitan planning organization, that when the city hit 50,000 back in 1995, we formed this regional organization with the city and the county and the state, and more recently have added NAU and Mountain Line, the transit agency. And we do regional transportation planning. And in fact, I had the pleasure of hiring Martin. He worked for the MPO for many years, and just in the last couple of years has moved over to the city full time. And I appreciate the history, and we'll share from. I came in 1997 at the same time, and be happy to share some of the federal perspective, both in terms of where we've been, but also some very exciting opportunities going forward with the recently passed law of the IIJA. And, so it's the Jobs Act, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So look forward to the conversation. Again, happy to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, David. Very good. Well, that is the group we have on the panel today. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm about to pass the mic over to Sam, who's going to take us through a trip down memory lane and the planning for Peddlers from the 70s to today. And it's going to be a really fun discussion. Again, if you're watching, especially on Facebook, please do take a moment to share this live stream. Let's amplify this message and get the community behind these ideas and behind this history so that we can move forward together and with clarity. Sam, take it away. Do you want me to put up the slides for you?
Yes, please. Okay, so sorry that the title looks wonky on this, but we won't rest on this slide. I open all my public presentations with an acknowledgement that we are joining you all today on the traditional and ancestral homelands of a variety of indigenous communities here in Northern Arizona, including but not limited to the Dene or Navajo, Hopi, Wallapai, and Havasupai peoples. And so I typically begin any of my presentations by offering NAU's formal land acknowledgement, which is: Northern Arizona University sits at the base of the San Francisco Peaks on homeland sacred to Native Americans throughout the region. We honor their past, present, and future generations who have lived here for millennia and will forever call this place home. So we're going to do a real whirlwind tour here through bicycle planning in the city of Flagstaff beginning in the 1970s. The very first documentation that I found on this topic is around the turn of the century, around 1969 to 1972. And so far as I know, the first citywide efforts to get some kind of bike infrastructure in the city started around 1972, when the city's Parks and Recreation Department creates a bicycle pathways program. It's not clear to me exactly how it was structured organizationally, but they invite members of the public and anyone who's interested in this topic to come and meet with the Parks and Rec Department to share their ideas for bicycle infrastructure in the city. And this is happening at this time for a couple of historical reasons, which Nat can probably speak to better than I, and others can as well. One is that the United States is experiencing a severe energy crisis, and there is a lot of concern about gas supply and the cost of gas. And so at the federal level, as well as at the state level, people are looking for alternate modes of transportation that might help ease that energy crisis situation. Additionally, Congress at this time is considering a bill to support the federal Department of Transportation in passing down funding to the states to put in bikeways and pedestrians walkways. So the state of Arizona in the early 70s contracts to have a plan written that assesses the state of bike infrastructure for the entire state, which I'll get to in a few slides. So in Flagstaff, there's an informal group called the Ponderosa Peddlers who are really interested in this topic. And they start working with the city and sort of coordinating with this state survey to get something off the ground. At the same time on campus, just around the same time in 1971, some of the first buildings for South Campus at NAU were finished. And so suddenly students are finding that they need to be able to get from South Campus to North Campus to go to classes more quickly. And at that time, you can kind of see from this photo, but there aren't really great ways to get between the two campuses, except by being on the same road as cars, especially along Knowles Drive. So there's a lot of interest from the campus community, not only in having bike routes that connect North Campus and South Campus, but also having bike routes to get to campus. So they are making proposals to the NAU administration at the time, which would be President Walkup, and also lobbying the city to get routes built to campus. And again, anyone can interrupt me at any point if you know things about this or want to share or have
Sam,
questions.
I'm going to pause you really quick as you're going
Please
to
do.
the next slide. Nat, did you recognize the Ponderosa Peddlers? Are you familiar with that group? I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, I came in '69, and I started attending planning and zoning commissions about 1971 or 2. And memories. I can, now that you mentioned that, I can remember that. I don't remember a lot of people on the streets at all, but I can remember things coming up in planning and zoning discussions. But also in '72, there was a very progressive council. They only lasted for 4 years, I think. And then it became more a conservative bent where cars give me freedom and that type of thing. So that rings true, this 71, 72. And then you mentioned Ken Ingalls. What an enthusiastic guy as far as park and recreation is concerned. I remember him clearly. And he went way into, I don't know, into the 90s maybe. But I'm sorry, I'm drifting.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing. David, go ahead.
Yeah, just throw in, Earth Day, 1970, about that same time. So a lot of interest in the environment as well.
Yeah, and I should mention here, I took out this slide, but one of the groups on campus that was really lobbying for bike paths was an organization called PACE, People Assembled for a Clean Environment. And so they were interested in a variety of things. They helped plan some of the first Earth Days on campus, but bicycle paths was one of the topics that they wanted to bring up and put forward. Okay, cool. So this is all, again, happening around the same time that the state of Arizona is putting together this plan, which is, so far as I know, the first statewide plan addressing bikeways, and not only bikeways, but also laws that are relevant to bicycles, whether it's traffic law or other kinds of relevant legislation, bike path ordinances, things like that in the state. This plan essentially notes that Flagstaff has no real bike infrastructure at this point in time. And I'm not sure how easily you can read this, given the size of the screen, but the plan puts forward, with input from that city bike pathways committee, some possible routes that could be implemented, but nothing's really happening at this current moment. There's just interest in having pathways built.
And Sam, you have a hard copy of that, don't you?
I do have a hard copy. It is right here.
That's pretty
So this
cool.
is the plan. Interestingly, I think I mentioned this to you, Adam, there's a big chunk of this plan that's actually about building bike lanes to and from schools, specifically elementary schools. And so a lot of the Flagstaff section is proposed bike lanes to and from schools, many of which still exist. But there's also survey data. There's a bunch of information about the state of bicycling in Arizona more broadly in this plan. If anyone wants to come check it out from us.
That's great.
So after the plan is released, with this input from the city of Flagstaff, the city council, with support from the Associated Students of NAU, put forward the idea for 2 different bike lanes. So you're seeing here a number of newspaper articles, some from the Lumberjack, the NAU student newspaper, and some from the Daily Sun, all from the spring of 1974, from May of 1974. City council has a meeting where they propose they say that they have already built 1 bike path by this point, which runs, I don't know if you can read, but runs from Thomas School, from North 4th Street on Lockett Road. Cool. And the big plan that's going to be discussed is putting in a bike lane on Beaver Street. At this point in time, Beaver Street is a 2-way street, just for point of reference, but it's the same width that it is now. So the council mentions that they have picked Beaver Street because ASNAU wants a path on Beaver Street and because it's one of the major ways. Oh yeah, good point. It's one of the major ways that people are getting to campus. So that's kind of the proposal before city council.
Sam, Ken asks, what was the city population and the EU population at that time? Do we know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could do a little digging and find out. It's much lower than it is today.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think David mentioned previously that in 1995 or so, the population was 50,000, right? Is that what you said?
That's right. And I think back in the 1970s, it was probably around between 20 and 25,000 would be my guess. And probably NAU was around 10 or less would be my, probably less, because I don't think it's ever been more than like 30% of the population.
And I should also note that, and Nat can probably speak to this as well, or any folks who are around during this time, there weren't very many routes to and from NAU's campus at this time. And there were also not very many roads on NAU's campus at this time. That under walk-up, there was a lot of building construction, as my colleague Sean Evans in the department likes to say, but not so much on the infrastructure to get between buildings. That came later under President Hughes.
Ken writes, I moved here in 1978 as a student, and I think NAU was 10,000 and Flag was less than 30,000. Interesting. Nat, did you want to add anything? All right, go ahead. Oh, Nat, you're muted.
Nat, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I think Dave's guess was right on, and also the other comment, pretty close for 78. I always thought that NAU was about 5,000 when I came here, and that was 69, as I said.
Cool. So council agrees that they approve this bike path, and then almost immediately they get sued. So a group of Beaver Street businessmen essentially say that they are concerned about the loss of parking, that it'll have negative impacts on their business, and that city council didn't go through the proper processes for putting forward this public ordinance, basically that there were procedural problems with the way that they did it. And as well, I mentioned before that 1973 Arizona statewide report, there is no specific law at this time that gives city council the power to create bike lanes. Some legal experts who discuss this in the Lumberjack and the Daily Sun say that it's pretty much implied that city council has that power because city council can, build roads, regulate traffic, all those kinds of things, but it's not actually clear in the law. So the lawsuit, which is filed sometime in the fall of 74-ish, as far as I can tell, holds up construction, is successful. In 1975, the group of businessmen who sued win the lawsuit, saying that basically city council needs to go through this process again and advertise it more, go through the proper steps, whatever the specific complaint was about how the ordinance was spread to the public. And I can't tell exactly what happens after that, but it seems like that bike path doesn't get built for at least a couple more years. So as you progress through, I can stop here too if other folks have memories of that time period.
Do you want to add anything? I think we're good.
Okay, cool. So towards the end of the decade, there's still a lot of interest, at least as indicated in the Lumberjack, in having bike lanes. So on campus, students are still pushing for them. Some are starting to be constructed. They're not very popular originally because they're right next to the pedestrian infrastructure, and there are a lot of collisions between bicyclists and pedestrians. And in the city, at some point around 1978 or a little bit before, so far as I know, the first citywide Bikeways Commission is created. As I haven't found any documentation saying structurally how it was made, but I think it was an informal committee to advise the city on bike path implementation, probably growing out of that earlier effort. And I've enlarged this map here from this Lumberjack article to demonstrate that these are some of the proposed bike routes. It's a hand-drawn map, so it's a little hard to see, but I would take note here of the proposed Forest Service bike path. This article notes that in 1978, the U.S. Forest Service is considering Flagstaff as one option to put in 40 miles worth of bike trails through Forest Service lands. So this, again, as far as I know, is an early progenitor of what will become the Flagstaff Urban Trail System.
Anything anyone would like to add to that? Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's. I've seen some of these documents before. I've never seen that particular map. What never fails to amaze me about them is that the same corridors show up from decade to decade to decade.
Yeah.
And if some of them we've built, some of them we're still waiting to build. But I mean, I see corridors identified on that map that are like, there's one, for example, that's in the Forest Service metal plan. The one at the top, that's the proposed Forest Service bike path, is a brand new idea in the metal planning document for the Forest Service.
Yeah, and I just add that Martin makes some beautiful maps, but mine still look like this.
I did try to find more maps of bike paths from this time to see if we had anything else, and I can only find this quality of map. So sorry about that.
Susan, did you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, without seeing the rest of the map, it's a little hard to project, but it looks like those Forest Service bike paths look like they might be also part of the Flagstaff Loop Trail that is now being pushed almost complete.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell, but I think you might be right. And again, some of the maps from this time period, they're hard to read. What comes out of this Bikeways Commission, this first one committee, is a 1979 plan. This is available through the City of Flagstaff's website. I think, Adam, you have a copy of it. I just included here an editorial from one of the members of the committee that put this plan together, basically saying, we've been talking about this since the early 70s and nothing is really happening. We've put in very few bike paths. The Beaver Street one still hasn't really been built at this point. And this is the first citywide plan to propose a total system. I put in their map. It's quite small. Sorry about that. The quality of the scan is not amazing, but you can maybe sort of see where it was supposed to go.
Sam, I'm looking for my my document to share with the group. Give me 1 second. Okay, I think I found it. Yep. Check this out. So here's the document, right? Y'all can see that? Yeah, is that coming through, Sam?
Yep.
And so just want to go through a couple pages here because I love some of the graphics that you'll find in it. I especially like this little graphic about knowing your cyclist that breaks down the kid, the novice, the commuter, the shopper, the tourist, and the racer, and the different types of cyclists that exists. And like to Martin's point, the different types of cyclists are very much still alive and well today. And it breaks down a lot of policies and really good information. I'm going to see if I can skip ahead a little bit to just a couple of the graphics I thought were really wonderful in terms of the planning. They really break down all these different corridors and give nice explanations to what they're proposing. So here's Santa Fe, for example. And Nat and others and David, if folks want to speak to this at all, please do chime in as we're going through this.
I'll just say for full disclosure that I'm in possession of the original copy of that plan.
No way.
Yeah, we had it scanned. You'll notice there's some marginal comments from the original owner, which are also kind of interesting to read. And that we don't have a clean copy. That's the only copy I have.
Wow.
We don't have one either. I checked. Flagstaff Public Library that's the only other place I would look to see if they have one. They sometimes have this kind of city documentation.
Do you want to, Sam, do you want a copy of our hard copy?
Yes, please.
You got it.
So here's Butler Avenue, and it speaks to the different needs along Butler. I mean, this is just like, it's just like gold to me. And it just really makes me, wonder more and more how we missed the mark with such good planning in place. We'll circle back to that, but go ahead and keep going. Or does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add? Nat, go ahead.
I was just going to say the stretch along Santa Fe that has the wonderful concrete bike path offset from the road. That happened while I was on city council. But the point is that section of Santa Fe was a concrete road and no sidewalks. And a lot of highway signs along the south side of it. And so if you're driving a car, it's a concrete road to define where you were going to be. If you're riding a bike, it's the same place. So cars and bikes, it was not very, very accommodating for bikes and wasn't very safe either.
And I'll just add for folks who might not know, but what was then referred to as Santa Fe Avenue is now referred to as Route 66. It was part of Highway 66. And one of the complications of looking at these old plans is that some of the street names are no longer the same. So there's a little bit of translation that has to happen to see where folks are just talking about in some of these plans.
Well, Adam, you said that what happened, I was going to flash back to, I think it's slide number 4, the middle column, the bottom paragraph is what history repeats itself, it seems like, over and over again, where the dean of NAUs, after receiving an outstanding number of students that filled out surveys saying we need more infrastructure, said there are no monies available at this time for a bike route. Students aren't showing too much concern anyway for bike paths. So that was what, 1973.
Right, which I don't know where that exactly came from, because I came across a lot of letters to the editor in the Lumberjack about bike paths, but hard to say. Okay, so what happens with this plan is that it gets presented to City Council on February 20th, 1979, and this is the Daily Sun coverage of that meeting. Again, I'm not sure how well you can read it, but basically it's what Susan was just referring to. Council is like, this seems like a great idea. Bike paths seem good. We don't think it's a high priority. We don't have money for it, but seems like a nice idea. And choose not to do anything in particular. So that brings us to the 1980s. In the 1980s, early 1980s, this is still a topic among city council candidates. So this excerpt I included, again, it's hard to read, but most of the candidates who are running for city council make at least some mention of both bike paths and mass transit. And I would say like a third to half of them say like, yeah, we should maybe do that, but it's not a high priority, or it's a medium priority. And the others are like, I don't really think that's suitable for Flagstaff. We have other problems. We should improve our roads. We should work on these other kinds of things. So it is still being discussed at the city council level, at least in major elections, but there's not much demonstrated urgency, at least not according to newspaper sources at the time. And you can see what I saw when I was looking at newspaper coverage, specifically in the lumber of the early 80s, is basically just a lot of bicyclists complaining. So bicyclists complain that the routes on campus are not very good. Like I said, a lot of the early routes were right next to pedestrian infrastructure, and there was a lot of conflict. So bicyclists would choose not to use them and would take the streets and interface with cars, and then both people would have complaints about that. And there just weren't very many paths built elsewhere in the city at this point that people could use, which I think Nat spoke to earlier. The routes that had been implemented were partial. And so in this particular letter to the editor, the cyclist is complaining that basically you'll start writing down a quote unquote bike route, and then it will suddenly end. And there will be nowhere for you to go. And essentially complaining that like city council doesn't seem to really care. That's at least the perspective presented by the lumberjack during this time period. When you get towards sort of the middle 80s, there starts to be more traction. And it's my understanding that this was actually happening at the same time period, but it's traction more around the urban trail system. And specifically about trails on Forest Service land. So the document to the left is a letter from John Sleva. Someone please correct me if that's wrong. Who was the planner for the city of Flagstaff at the time, to Dale Shewalter, who some folks may know is the quote unquote father of the Arizona Trail, who was also a school teacher here in Flagstaff, talking about the fact that the city is working on a new planning document called the Growth Management Guide 2000, and that there is a specific portion of that documentation which is supposed to be about bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, combined with this growing interest that I know John Sleva had, according to him, since the early 1980s in getting that Forest Service bike route infrastructure built. So there's a push around 86, 87 to get the urban trail system kind of started, to incorporate it into other planning that's happening at the city level. And this seems like a good place to pause.
Absolutely. Who would like to jump in, Nat? Go ahead.
I would just say that the Guide 2000 was passed while I was on city council. And the thoughts of, I have it somewhere. The thought of the Foots Trail system and a system that was both recreational and transportational really started late 70s and early 80s. But you're right, it didn't really come to pass until about 88, 89. When the first trail went in, and that was between Thorpe Road. It's it's a portion of what's called the Karen Cooper Trail section between Thorpe Road and up to Mead, because there was a trail there already, just a little single track. And with, I think it's a Heritage Fund, Arizona Heritage Fund, or what actually paid for that. So you're absolutely right. 87, 88, 89, 90, that's when things actually started to happen. And you bring back so many memories. Thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in? Martin, go ahead.
I'll jump in. I think at that time it was called the Ditch Pool Trail. If I remember.
Yeah, it actually went pass speed through the ditch trail up to, I think that's Saturn. It goes around and ended there.
Yeah, so I think there's an interesting, in 1988 the city convened an ad hoc committee on the Flagstaff urban trail system, and Sam, do you have a copy of the report that they produced in 1988?
I do indeed.
You do indeed. All right, very good. It's interesting that the chairman of that ad hoc committee was Dale Shewalter, and about that same time, he was sort of in the process of becoming the father of the Arizona Trail. And I think, Nat, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I think the fact that he was involved in both of those efforts at the same time ended up with the Arizona Trail going through the middle of Flagstaff on planned foots trails, because the Arizona Trail goes through no other cities in Arizona, only, but it goes through the middle of Flagstaff, and I attribute that entirely to Dale Shewalter's participation on both of those efforts.
I can't say specific to that, but yes, I remember Dale so well, and the work and the commitment he had, both on the foots, but mainly on the Arizona Trail system. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised what your conclusion.
And I should say that some of the materials I was just showing you are Dale's stuff. They are the Dale Shewalter sub-collection within the Arizona Trail Association records. So he kept a lot of documentation of his involvement in the Foots Trail.
I'd love to see that sometime.
Come on in, I'll show it to you.
I would just add from a personal level that John Sleva hired me back in 1997 to work for the city, and I had the privilege of meeting Dale only a couple times before he passed. And when I think of some of the work that they put into getting the Foots Trail started, and Nat, I think you're in the same category as well.
Well, I'm with Dale.
all the work went into it, and it was like, now we think of it as kind of an automatic, but at the time it required a lot of effort to convince people that this was actually a decent idea. And when I think about what they did and what they went through and how far they got and how far we've come since then, I really feel like we stand on the shoulders of giants, really, and have to acknowledge that that's where we are.
I have often said that John Sleva and Ursula Montoya too were really the father of the Foots system. It really wouldn't have happened without somebody with that type of interest and dedication and ability to sell it. Because even on my city council, I won't mention the name, but one said that we don't want to put any money into these urban trail systems because it's a place where there'll be rapes and robberies and things like that. And he was a city council member. But there are also anecdotal stories from realtors that at one time the city would have trouble getting a Foots Trail in because neighborhoods didn't want it in there. But then, as I was going to say, the anecdotal stories from realtors now is that's a selling plus for some people in their homes. So again, back to what I was saying, there's been a wonderful progression through the 70s and 80s and 90s and now 2000s.
So you all spoiled my next couple slides, but I'll run through them anyway. So as I mentioned, around the time that the Foots Trail is being conceptualized is the same time that, as Nat spoke to, the City Council is adopting this Growth Management Guide 2000. Again, this is hard to read, but the section that I've pulled out here is the Bikeways and Pedestrian sub-element narrative. And since you can't read it, the takeaway I'll offer is that basically in the narrative section of this, essentially the Growth Management Guide says, hey, remember that 1979 Bikeways plan that we did? That was a good plan. We should implement that plan. And kind of goes on to say, like, here's what's been achieved, which is not a lot from that plan. Let's move forward with it, especially with the Foots, which was a newer idea that I don't think appeared in as much detail in the 79 plan, if any detail at all. And this is the map of the bikeway plan from the Growth Management Guide. Again, it's kind of small and maybe hard to see, especially translating what kinds of bike paths these are, because some of them are off-street, on-street, and then existing or proposed. But this is roughly what the plan looked like for bikeways in the growth management guide. And I think this plan is adopted by City Council in April of 1987. And in May of 87, Dale Shewalter writes to City Council and says, hey, a bunch of people and I have been getting together to talk about an urban trail system, like I wrote in my previous letter to the editor. And since you just passed this growth management guide, this is a really good time to start thinking about the Flagstaff, what will become the Flagstaff urban trail system. And City Council, and hopefully Nat can corroborate this for me because I only found the unsigned version, puts forward a resolution creating the Flagstaff Urban Trail System Ad Hoc Committee in October of 87. Yes, did I get that right?
I was elected in 88, but I was attending council meetings. And as I remember, that's correct.
So the committee basically is charged with coming up with a plan, which Martin spoke to earlier, to present to City Council for the Flagstaff Urban Trail System. Here's a sort of highlighted map. This is again from Dale Shewalter's records. I don't know if he did this annotation or not, but you can see that it has 5 different proposed routes, which are described in sort of brief detail up in the upper right-hand corner. And Route 1, I think, is the trail we were just talking about. The what's now the Karen Cooper Trail, or was the Ditch Pool Trail, I think, if I'm reading that map right.
Correct.
So this is what the ad hoc committee sort of conceptualizes as the first stage of the foots, is to build these 5 trails. And then in 1988, 2 things happen. One, in March of 1988, the Flagstaff City Council passes the Bed, Board, and Booze Tax, BBB tax, Proposition 304. And very shortly thereafter, the Urban Trails Ad Hoc Committee puts forward their final report to City Council in March of 1988. And they talk about potentially using revenues from the BBB tax to help fund the foots implementation. So these things kind of happen at once. There's at least some funding stream in addition to other existing funding streams, like Nat, as you said, the Heritage Fund, other federal funding, Arizona funding, parks funding, different funding sources.
I was going to comment on how amusing it was, how many times in all your preceding letters, how many times people suggested that the bicyclists build these trails on their own and maintain them on their own. I thought it's a relief that they finally decided to come up with a funding mechanism rather than have us all out there with our shovels. I'd like to see them try that with the car drivers.
You're muted, Adam.
Sorry about that. I said, does anybody else want to chime in?
I would just like to add a side note. Martin said that John Sleever hired him, and Adam and I just got an email from John. And one of the things that John Sleever said is, I hired Martin and it was the best hire I ever made.
Yeah.
Oh, there's still time to change his mind. I'm working on that.
All right, it's a great point, Susan. Great.
Cool. So by sort of later in 88, and again, Nat, hopefully you can kind of fill this in for me because the documentation I found is a little unclear. some of the urban trail has been constructed, and there's a projected opening date of 1989, coincidentally, when I was born, to actually have some trails existing. Another thing I just want to point out here, because we haven't really focused on this for this presentation, but throughout these early plans, I should say that the city of Flagstaff and NAU are really like tightly linked in these plans. There's a lot of recognition in almost all of these plans that many cyclists are NAU students or faculty who are getting to or from campus, and that it's in both the city and the university's best interest to collaborate on building this kind of infrastructure to serve that community of cyclists as well as other folks. This is particularly noticeable because if you go back to that newspaper clipping real fast, I just thought this was funny. Apparently the signs and logo for the Foots Trail were designed, or at least according to this article, by an NAU commercial art class. I don't know if that's still the logo. Maybe it's been changed since then, but initially that's how they came up with the branding for the Foots.
Nat, would you like to jump in?
I was just looking at that last paragraph, and that's the time that, name just escaped me, but the environmental area around what we used to call the duck pond or the city pond, that's what they're addressing there. And so that was the extension of the trail from Thorpe heading south.
And I think too, around this time period, Nat, or anyone else who knows, there was also, oh, awesome. This is sort of the same time period that the city is also looking at open spaces and greenways, which is another thing I haven't really touched on, but there's a lot of planning in that area that overlaps, especially with the urban trail system, in terms of coordinating greenways with these pedestrian and bicyclist infrastructure routes. Was that around this time period too? I think
that was in the 90s, in the mid-90s and the late 90s, and that was Ursula Montano and the idea of linear parks and Foots trails being kind of the artery of some of these linear parks. And Martin probably can talk to that because that's when he appeared.
Sam, I think you mentioned the open space and greenways plan from 1997. Yeah.
I have a copy of that if you want it.
I think we have one, ball check. So skipping ahead to the 1990s, this is when in May of 1990, I didn't include this, but the city puts forward another resolution basically saying it's been about 10 years since we did the first Bikeways plan in 1979. We're going to do another one. And so what this is a letter from a person that maybe some of you all know, but someone who is a planner, I think for the city, and who is a member of the new 1991 Bikeways Committee, sending a copy of the new 1991 plan, which I'll get to in a minute, to one of the state senators for Arizona, talking about, again, this sort of renewed interest in putting in bikeways, open spaces, and talking about developments in Oregon, which is of interest mostly to me because later on in the 90s, with the Flagstaff 2020 Community Visioning Project, which I'll touch on briefly, there's also a lot of inspiration that we took from Oregon. So in 91, that new Bikeways Committee that's convened in May of 1990 and works for, I think, about a year, puts out, so anyone can correct me if they know better, puts out this new Flagstaff bicycle plan. And again, I included a section of this plan that basically says, remember that 1979 plan that we did? A lot of the goals that we have right now are still the same. We should do those things. Although at this point in time, there are more bikeways than there were in 1979. So what I've included here is sort of a map. And again, I know it's small, but you can see that the black dotted lines are existing bikeways of some type. And then the white dotted lines are proposed bikeways. And this image, the graph to the right, shows the total miles of existing and proposed bike lanes in Flagstaff from 1988 to 1992. And you can sort of see that in 1988, there's around 6.5 miles total of bike lanes, with a projected growth to 14.4 miles by 1992. And I think this is not including the foots, but I couldn't swear to that. I would have to look at it.
What you got there, Nat? What is that? Nat, maybe unmute yourself.
Yeah, he's got the open space plan up there.
Okay. Yeah. Now you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry, couldn't find it there for a minute. I couldn't hold up that and unmute myself at the same time. So, David, thanks for reading that. On that map you just showed, Sam, the route along Santa Fe that I was talking about is in there, and that was all part of trying to remove the bulletin boards along there. And so when they were removed, in the process, railroad land was turned over to the city that had the signs on it. And once that was turned over to the city, then the city was able to put in that separated bike trail along Santa Fe. So they were connected together, removing those bulletin boards, which was a very big political challenge because of the businesses. So I guess the moral of that little statement is that the Foots Trail, the interconnect and bikeways are always interconnected with businesses and parking and all kinds of other challenges.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a couple other kind of seminal events and people around that same time. So I just looked it up. In 1989, Paul Jones was hired by John Sleva, probably the second best hire he made. And Paul Jones was a real champion for the Foots Trail and beautification, and really helped move a lot of things forward. And then also in 1991, at the federal level, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, also known as ICE-T, came in to bear and really brought a lot of money, federal money, for the first time into bicycle and pedestrian facility planning and construction. And the city was very successful in securing a number of grants while that program was in place.
Martin?
I think when I've looked at those documents from the past, I think it's kind of interesting from this time period that there seems to be kind of a distinction drawn between the foot system and what they called Class 1 bikeways, which was like the thing along Route 66. And I don't know at what point later when we started to kind of commingle those terms and thought of Class 1 bikeways as being the same as the foot system. I'd also add, if you go back to that map and graphic for a moment, it's just a historical interest that map, the lines on that map were created with something called formaline, and the textures on the graph were created with something called zipatone, which those of us who were born before 1989 will remember.
I actually know about zipatone because my early research interest is in comic books. So I've seen zipatone in person, but yes, I've never used it.
Nat, would you like to add something?
Just Martin's comment about different classes of bike routes. There was a professor at NAU, Dr. Hoyt, who at many of the bike discussions was adamant. He was a bike rider. He rode to the university all the time. And his opinion was you don't want to have bike lanes because it promotes the idea that bikes are different transportation element than cars. Think about that. And it's still the case. I think people think, well, bikes are one thing, and they're not necessarily equal to vehicle transportation, auto transportation. And his position was we need to treat them equally.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in some of the early NAU justifications for not putting in dedicated bike lanes, that's also the NAU administration's point of view, is that if they are co-equal, there's no need for a segregated bike lane or even just a painted bike lane. And that also it's important that bicyclists obey traffic law, and that if you create a separate infrastructure, even if that's just a painted line, somehow you're removing them from traffic law, or people feel like they don't need to adhere to traffic law. So I've also seen that argument pop up from different vantage points in looking through some of these materials.
I think that difference of opinion, that dichotomy persists into today. And the one group is represented, he was kind of a champion of cycling in the 70s and 80s, name of John Forrester. And the school of thought was vehicular cyclists, that cars are vehicles, and we fare best when we act like and are treated like vehicles on the roadway. More recently, there's been a whole lot of interest in separation, separating cyclists from traffic, and I'm not really sure where we are in that discussion between the vehicular cyclists and the separation, but it seems like we're coming where that argument is kind of coming to a close.
I think so too, and I know there have been kind of experiments in places. What was it called, Martin? Naked streets in like the Netherlands or somewhere, where they just like removed all striping for everybody, and it's like, okay, everybody's got to pay attention to everybody. It's not like I own the lane. And there's this kind of, I guess at the time, what would have been considered viral, where this guy backs into a roundabout looking at the camera, and he just walks backwards into this very busy roundabout, and was perfectly comfortable because he knew everybody was paying attention to everybody else. It was a kind of a short-lived phenomenon, but I think that was one extreme of that position.
Matt, did you want to add anything? Okay, keep going.
Okay, so this is what Nat was saying before, but by the early 90s, the urban trail is picking up steam, more parts are being built. I'm sure others can speak to this better than me. But, it's becoming more of a reality and is gaining in popularity by the early 90s. And around the same time in 93, the city does a series of updates to the growth management guide as working papers. And this is what I was referring to in terms of linking greenways and open spaces to trails. That comes from this working paper, which is, again, from 1993, talking about the foots and its relationship to the city's thinking around open spaces and green belts from this time period, which then results in that, 97 open spaces plan that you shared, Nat?
Yeah, the data on the final copy is 98.
98, okay.
But it was
so this
90,
is,
yeah.
Right. So around this time period, there's kind of this holistic, as far as I can tell, and again, others who are there can speak to it better than me, but there's this holistic view of looking at, how do we incorporate green space and parks and pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure sort of holistically within the city, and what are the natural linkages between those kinds of spaces and space uses.
Very good. Keep going, Sam.
Cool. So the next big thing that happens, and I'm going to stop in the 90s, so someone else has to pick up in the 2000s, but the next big thing that happens in terms of sort of assessing community values around bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure is the Flagstaff 2020 Community Visioning Project that I referred to earlier, that Nat was a part of, and others may have been as well. And this was a collaborative venture. The city was involved, the county, NAU, a bunch of other agencies. That was supposed to be sort of a public community visioning process, linked to the fact that, as David alluded to before, at this time, Flagstaff was experiencing very rapid growth. And there was a lot of concern about the rate of growth of the city and what it would mean for the city. So this was a proactive attempt to sort of talk about what do we want the city of Flagstaff to look like in the year 2020, what are our shared values, what kind of infrastructure do we want, whether that's social or physical, where do we want to go as a city during this time period.
Yeah, if I could pick up that thread. So I arrived on the scene in 1997 at the start of this new MPO process. And at the same time, the city and county embarked on what was the first regional plan in the state of Arizona. And that was Ursula Montano leading the charge on that. And as a young organization, we contributed some of the funding because there's going to be a transportation element, and helped to bring in really a pretty key player in a lot of transportation in Flagstaff. That was Jim Charlier of Charlier and Associates, was a part of the consulting team. And that was kind of the progression, was going from the growth management guide where they talked about activity centers to starting to identify some of those a little more clearly, and really talking about how do we connect all of those with bike and pedestrian facilities as well as the roads. And the open space and Greenways plan had just been recently adopted, and so a lot of those concepts were brought in, including, I think, the neighborhoods concept, and part of its trails that would connect those neighborhoods were brought into play. And then I'm going to try to share my screen. Share screen, and
let's see, I might be able to assist you.
Sure. I'll just share screen, see what happens here. Am I sharing my screen?
Not yet.
Entire screen, maybe. I'm not sure what it's telling me.
You might need to scroll down and click.
Oh, there we go. I just needed to click on my screen there. Okay, and now, oh, I love that. I love that view there. So one of the early products that we produced with Charlier and Associates, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Is the Pedestrian and Bicycle Design Guide. And in a lot of these documents, we talked about what are the cross sections of the street, what should bicycle lanes look like, what should pedestrian underpasses and tunnels look like. And a fair number of those got incorporated into later versions of the city's engineering standards. So I think this was a great step forward for bicycle system planning and development. So we'll stop sharing.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Martin?
I'll pick up on that early 2000s thread. I think Sam mentioned that back in the 90s, when the city council decided to dedicate a portion of the BBB tax to foot trails. That was a seminal event because it meant that Foots had regular dedicated funding that really helped it take off. In 2000, the city approved a transportation sales tax, a portion of which went to ped and bike projects, including the Foots. So with a dedicated source of funding for the next 20 years, I mean, we're only in 2021, it expired in 2020. It really took off. And I've got a couple of stats. In 2000, the city had 27 miles of foot trails. By 2010, we had 50 miles of foots trails, and that was almost entirely due to the fact that we had regular funding from the transportation sales tax. David was intimately involved in putting together that proposal for the voters, including what went on it, how much was going to be raised, how much the tax was for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You did a ton of work on that sales tax as a young planner. The other thing it did was right after it was adopted, with the money set aside for ped and bikes, the city went on kind of a splurge of adding bike lanes to streets simply by restriping what was existing and adding bike lanes. And I don't have any stats on the mileage, but I'm guessing we went from very, very few to a whole lot. Most of the ones that we have today.
Yeah, and I'll say this: they're kind of a mutual admiration society. Martin worked tirelessly with traffic engineers, which is, I don't know, maybe some of them are listening, so I'll stop right there. And in showing them what was possible, and in the education, this was a movement about new urbanism at the time and neo-traditional neighborhoods, where they talked about narrowing street lane widths, and just a lot of education went on during that time. And Martin spent time in the field, marking pavement. It was like, yeah, you can move this in here, you can move this in here. Maybe we'll get a full bike lane. Maybe we'll get something better than what we have. But it really moved us forward a lot. And again, during this time, especially in the early 2000s, the state had a transportation enhancement review committee. And boy, it was great times where we'd lock ourselves, a group from across the state would lock ourselves in a hotel for 3 or 4 days, review about 100 applications from across the state, and award beautification and trail and bike path grants. And I wish I had a better memory. I'd recite some of those to you, but that really moved forward. And having the BBB and other local funds to match grants with was a huge advantage in securing some of those grants.
Thanks for sharing that, David. And going to pause to read Ed's comment, who's tuning in. I moved to Flagstaff in Cheshire in 2000 and rode the now Karen Cooper Trail daily. I remember ducking under barbed wire to keep going. It's fascinating to hear about the early developments of the foots. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for joining us, Ed. Any other comments before we continue on?
I just have a couple things from the 90s. So taking us a step back. So Flagstaff 2020, I just want to make a plug here. In 2020, a really amazing student that I worked with, Marley Oakes, curated this online exhibit about the Flagstaff 2020 community visioning process for the year 2020, which is all the more amazing because her work was interrupted by the pandemic. So if folks are interested in learning more about that process and sort of what was happening in terms of green spaces, open space, I forget who talked about the regional growth boundary that came out of the Flagstaff 2020 process. We have a bunch of resources online through this exhibit website, so check it out. And then the only other thing, this is the final report of the Flagstaff 2020 document talking about the next phase of planning for bike and pedestrian trails, including the foots. So everything that was just discussed about the 2000s. And finally, I'm hoping that some of the panelists can help me identify these random bicyclists from around 2000. These are some of the handful of historic photos I could find of bicycle trails in Flagstaff. I'm sure we have more, but these were the ones I found. So if you recognize any of these people, let me know.
I don't recognize anyone, but I do want to just mention something about the Vision 2020 and just the power of participation. That was I was not there for that effort. It was wrapping up as I came on board, but there were so many people involved with that and so heavily invested in that during the regional plan process, we were, people were holding up copies and saying, yeah, and the Vision 2020, we said this, is that in the plan? And I know in front of city council and others, when developments and other things would come through, people kept referring back to this Vision 2020 document. And, we've done pretty well since then, but I don't think we've ever kind of reached that pinnacle in terms of public participation and that kind of enthusiastic support for a planning effort. Be nice to see that happen again.
Sam, did you have more slides, or was that the end of it?
The next ones are just contact information. So if you are interested in any of the things that I shared and want to look at them, in person and not on a blurry, tiny screen, please check out our website or contact me or our staff, and I can help connect you with those resources. But that's it as far as my slides.
Wow, that is so great. Sam, thank you so much. Folks, let's give Sam a round of applause. That was amazing. Really appreciate your efforts and work in research and taking us down memory lane with all those different planning documents and the history. I think you really summed it up well and captured the history well. So thank you for that. And thank you for your willingness to share that with the community tonight. That's really been wonderful. Any questions or comments regarding any and all of what Sam presented? And folks, I want to let you know that next, I know we're over on our time, but I'd like to let Martin speak very briefly to the ATMP and the Active Transportation Master Plan and what we're working on today. But yes, thank you so much, Sam. It's been really an amazing presentation to have. But yeah, panelists, please, questions, comments, anything you'd like to add?
No, not at this
Sam,
time.
I was going to ask Sam, under what pretext did you assemble all this information? Was that just a personal project or a dissertation?
No, it's not a dissertation. I would have done more research if it was a dissertation. No, I a couple months ago joined the NAU Transportation Action Team, which is part of the broader environmental caucus here. And there's a lot of folks on that team who are really amazing and have a lot of expertise in transportation systems that I don't have as an archivist. I just work in a library. And so I asked if I could make a contribution by researching the history of bike lanes on campus as NAU looks to update its guidance, particularly around e-bikes, and put together a presentation for them, and then got really, really interested in the topic. And again, since I ride anyway, and this is what I do all day, it was a pretty natural fit for me to start looking into it.
Well, thank you very much. Well done.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, I'll just say, reflecting on history is great. Obviously the community's been at this for, over half a century. And sometimes it just takes that long. It'd be great if we can figure out better ways to accelerate and expedite these things. But sometimes you plant that seed and it takes a long time for it to grow into something important and useful. And I think we're getting much, much closer. So thank you, Sam.
My pleasure.
Very good. Sam, you're out of the hot seat now. We're going to put Martin in that hot seat. Martin, do you want to present maybe a couple slides or speak to the ATMP a little bit and where we're at and some of those, talk a little bit about the evolution from these documents to the document that we're currently working on. And I liked how you said that, it's a continuum.
Yeah, so I guess this will be the coda to the presentation, but we mentioned that the city had a transportation sales tax from 2000 to 2020 that included dedicated money for ped and bike facilities. Well, in 2018, again, thanks to a lot of hard work from David Wessel, the city voted. The citizens voted to renew that transportation sales tax between 2020 and 2040. As part of that, there's a set aside of $29 million for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, which we'll have available to us. We do have available to us over the next 20 years for bike and ped projects. So in order to figure out how to best spend that money, we are working on an active transportation master plan, a component of which is recommendations for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. And I don't know, I can't put anything in the chat, but I can I'll share my screen and maybe just show a couple of links to some of the information that we're working on. It's a work in progress. We're looking for feedback from the community and comments from people on what we're recommending and what we've identified as priorities for infrastructure projects for walking and biking. And let's see if
Martin, as you do that and as you attempt to share it, I want to let folks know that in the description to this live stream, both on YouTube and Facebook, there's links to much of which Sam spoke to in the different documents, along with the ATMP landing page on the city website that links you to all sorts of good stuff that Martin's about to speak about. So you're welcome to join us and look at it as Martin's speaking to it, but also look at it after the fact. And I'll just say there's also a link to the Portland consultation work with the Jacobs consultation. And it's their recent effort in 2018 to come up with a holistic plan that basically adds 60% capacity to their avenues that are being adjusted through these 18 projects. So take a look at what Portland's doing as well as part of the links in the description. But Martin, I see your shared screen. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is what a modern Bikeways map looks like. Kind of the concept that we're working on is a hierarchy of bikeways in 4 classes, and of course the primary and secondary ones would be the main ones that people would use to get around town. The idea is that it's based on kind of comfort planning for cyclists. So we want every one of these routes shown to be low stress and comfortable for all levels of cyclists. So whether you're picking up a bike for the first time, if you're a kid, if you've biked for years and years and years, all would find this network to be comfortable. And part of the secret to doing that is what we talked about before, which is helping getting bicyclists separated from traffic, either via foot trails or bike lanes that are moved away from vehicle traffic. And of course, a significant part of that is how we manage crossings and intersections. So that's an integral part of it. And I won't say anything more about that. In the old days, we pretty much had bike lanes and foot trails were our 2 main tools for accommodating bicyclists. And we typically put foot trails through the woods, yes, and through green space, but also along busy roads. Now we have a lot more tools at our disposal, and places like Portland and Boulder and Fort Collins and Davis have really pioneered a lot of interesting new facilities for bicyclists that meet the objectives that we're looking for, which is to make all levels of cyclists feel comfortable on the road. So we have all kinds of different facilities identified for the network that you see before you that go well beyond just foot trails and bike lanes. And the good news is we have the $29 million over the next 20 years to implement that. So we want to get a head start on that and get a functional system in place over the next 5 years with that money. I should also mention that Mountain Line, the transit agency for the region, received a grant last year for $5.5 million for what are termed first mile, last mile projects. And it's really ped and bike projects that help facilitate access to transit. So it's another $5.5 million for us. So the total is $34.5 million roughly over the next 20 years, kind of front loaded in the next 5 years to spend on ped and bike projects. And I would, there's a couple of, if you go to Adam's site that he just referenced, there's a landing page for the ATMP. There's a survey open until toward the end of December. I would encourage all of you to take it if you haven't already. There's a couple of basic questions, but the biggest part of it is open-ended question where we just ask for your comments on the draft plan, and we'd love to hear from you. It's critical that we hear from the community on some of these issues. And then I think there are also links to online maps that, I'll admit are a work in progress, but they show kind of what we're thinking about in terms of recommendations for infrastructure. And I would encourage you to go through and look at them. It enables you to kind of zoom in and zoom out in great detail. We didn't have to use any Formalane or Zipatone to make those maps. They're completely digital. And we'd love to hear your feedback. Oh, and we'll go one more place. There's a landing page for the ATMP, and you can access all that information from there.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. And a quick follow-up question for you, Martin. Obviously, we've been talking about the ATMP, the Active Transportation Master Plan, for a while now. Can you speak to some of the values and how are they being integrated into our engineering, planning, and design and development of our roads here in Flagstaff today?
Well, the other part of the transportation sales tax pays for a handful of road projects. The one that is kind of on everyone's mind, or is most visible, I guess, is the Lone Tree Overpass project, which is going through kind of public review. And we are doing our best to incorporate more comfortable bike facilities as part of those projects. So, for example, on the Lone Tree Overpass, the bike lanes will be separated from traffic and actually physically separated by a fence barrier in between the bike lane and traffic. There's a mini version of it that we built on the new 4th Street Bridge. If you notice on the northbound side, the bike lane is away from traffic and separated from the roadway by a fence, by a metal fence. Same on the southbound side. So Lone Tree will look similar to that. I think we learned a little bit from that project and have incorporated that as well. A couple other transportation projects will be coming up over the next couple of years, and we are moving forward with implementing more comfortable bikeways as part of those projects.
And Martin, I'm going to put you on the spot. You mentioned the importance of intersections and safety. And something I have personal concerns about as a council member with Lone Tree is the 7-lane intersections that are being planned for at 66 and Butler. Can you speak to 7-lane intersections through the lens of a pedestrian or a cyclist, and the comfort or discomfort that research shows in regards to best practices about intersections?
Yeah, I think we're on the right track in terms of we're thinking about a lot of innovative pedestrian and bike facilities to include as part of that intersection. But I think having an intersection that's that large, that has that many lanes, just automatically makes it challenging to comfortably accommodate peds and bikes. And we can do everything we can, but at some point, you kind of reach a limit to how comfortable peds and bikes are going to be. Safety is always a little bit tricky, but we can look at it in terms of the speed at which traffic moves through the intersection can affect safety for peds and bikes. And then every time you add lanes, turn lanes, through lanes, there are additional potential points of conflict between a pedestrian and the vehicles and bicyclists as well. So if you think of like a 2-lane section, for a pedestrian to cross that, they have 2 potential points of conflict. At 7, there are 7 lanes, 7 points of conflict just on that one leg. And if you look at all the turn movements, it kind of goes up from there.
Yeah, that's an issue, right? And what you'll hear from our traffic engineers is that we're trying to accommodate the projected growth demand on our roads by looking at the amount of cars that we project are going to be driven and needing to be moving from A to B throughout these different avenues. And it conflicts with our goals around climate neutrality and sustainability, which is capping those levels at today's numbers of road demand. And so we really need this big shift that we keep talking about at the city and with our sustainability team, and to shift folks out of cars onto alternative modes. But to do that, we need those holistic avenues that are connected, marked, educated about, and all these other things that all these great planning documents speak to over the decades. And so, yeah, David, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, if I could. Thank you, Council Member. So the ATMP does a great job, and credit to Martin for a lot of the analysis, identifying all those gaps. As Sam kept pointing out, the 79 plan is great. We ought to do it. We ought to do it. We ought to do it year after year. And a lot didn't get done, and a lot still remains to be done. And Martin has really laid the groundwork through the ATMP on where those investments need to be made to fill in those gaps. And there's a kind of a wonderful opportunity with this new infrastructure bill that was just signed into law, with a lot of funding for PEDs and bikes. And with our funding in place through 419, we stand a good chance to compete well for those and really leverage that dollars. We are at Metro Plan, the MPO, updating our regional transportation plan. And it was really those efforts back preceding both the elections that resulted in PED and bike funding that really cemented those funding opportunities. And part of that was really combining some really strong technical analysis with the already strong emotional analysis, if you will, for these facilities. And we're looking to move that forward. As you mentioned, Council Member, there's a carbon neutrality plan. We have these as a region and as a city, these carbon neutrality goals. Part of this next regional transportation plan update is really going to be looking hard at the technical analysis on what needs to happen, both from the land use side as well as the transportation side. So how can we shorten trips? How can we make those trips more viable by these other modes? What do those facilities need to look like? And I think one of the things that the ATMP really sets us up for, but is the hard work to come, is all those documents you referenced. There's work, like with any plan, you need to implement it. So you need changes to the zoning code. You need changes to the engineering standards. You need changes to subdivision ordinances. If that map that Martin put up there, there's all that kind of empty green space south of I-40 between Lone Tree and Butler. What's that going to look like? And there's some aspects to that in the master plan, but there's also a lot of that that's going to be left to the development community. And that's where we really need, as we go in filling in all these gaps, we need to make sure that the future is building the kind of systems that we need to. And all that's going to play out through these development guidelines and ordinances. So, Council Member, you have a lot of work to do.
Yep, I agree with that 100%. And I'll just say really quickly before I turn it over to Susan that, I'm glad you brought up 419 and the funding from 419, because what I've learned in my time on council is that a lot of times the best thing to do is to look at the plans that are currently in the pipeline and ensure that they're done the right way with the right values and philosophies at their cores. And there's so much room for opportunity. And 419 really allows us the funding above and beyond that 29 million that Martin spoke to build for bike and ped needs. Things like intersections, things like congestion management, traffic demand management, and thinking about alternatives and outside the box. And David, like you mentioned, educating our team about what's possible. And so, I think the ATMP helps with that. I think consultation work with agencies like Jacobs is going to be helpful if we pursue that. And I really hope that our engineering team will really embrace and champion these ideas that are in the ATMP through all the work we do, because we spend so many millions every year on engineering and designs and roads. And so it's not what we do, it's how we do it. So you're right, David. I got my work cut out for me, and I've been working hard for the last 3 years. That's for darn sure. But Susan, go ahead, jump in and unmute yourself.
Okay, well, As we talk about existing infrastructure and the monies that we have for it, it looks great. But as we look back at this great work that Sam has presented to us, you can see a pattern where people get very enthused. There's lots of plans. Sometimes it almost seemed like people said, oh, why don't you build a master plan? Just get out of our hair. You go build your plan, and then we can ignore it later and not fund it. And luckily, we've moved beyond that, and thank God we have. But we still have a lot to do, and especially when you look in the light of the climate emergency declaration and the carbon neutrality plan. Of course, as you know, being on the Bike Advisory Commission, I'm going, Yahoo! This means finally we're going to get what we deserve, and we're going to make what we want to, and we're going to actually implement this master plan, which is so fulfilling if it could ever happen. But we definitely have to be on guard for things getting derailed and things not happening. But we did see just in the last year how fast something can happen if there's enough public input. And unfortunately, it came at the cost of a tragic accident with fatalities involved. But we do finally see some infrastructure that went up in 6 months. That is amazing. That is awesome. I also have concerns that even though we got funding through the 419 resolution, that we only are.
Oh, Susan, you're frozen. Uh-oh. Okay, while Susan's
Primary.
us. Oh, Susan, you broke up when you were saying that we got funding from 419.
Yeah, so we got the funding, but and with the Bike Advisory Commission, we went through every project and prioritized everything and broke them into high priority, medium, and low priority objects. Well, the money from 419 only pays for most of the highest priority items. It doesn't pay for the middle or low priority items, and we'll be depending on grants. Hopefully, some of these infrastructure monies can help augment that. But if we are looking at really completing and meeting the carbon neutrality goals for 2030, we have to put all of our bike ped and mass transit objectives on hyperdrive and get them done. We've already, how many cities had those master plans going back to the 1970s? If they had been implemented, climate change may not be the crisis it is today, but we're finding out now how expensive climate change is going to be for all of our city structures, our human life, and our ecosystems. And so now I'm going to step back off my soapbox and back away from the mic. You can mute me now.
I would just add to that to say, you know, I didn't necessarily emphasize this, but there is hopefully it came through that in the history of bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure in the state and in the city, environmental concerns and climate concerns have always been part of that conversation. In the 70s, that was a different conversation than what we're having now. You know, the concerns were more around air pollution, you know, other kinds of things, but it speaks to the same topics of how our transportation system supports healthy ecosystems for humans and other living beings, or whether or not they do. And that's been a through line in basically every plan that we outlined, was promoting human health, promoting natural health for the environment. That's consistent in every one of those plans starting from the 70s, which, since I didn't necessarily mention it, is also the birth of, you know, what we think of now as the contemporary environmental movement, right? It's the same time period. So I think that's a really good and important aspect to bring out as we look to the ATMP and to these past plans, to say that this is always part of what infrastructure is supposed to do, is create a livable, workable, physical and built environment for people and other creatures.
That's great. David's tuning in, and David writes, on a 7-lane intersection, and he's referring to Lone Tree, can we program the traffic light to have a bike ped segment to allow free all direction movement during that segment? Martin, I know you know very well, along with others on this panel, the different alternative intersection designs and opportunities. I recently was out in Portland and also in Eugene, and they have a lot of bike infrastructure where there's like a green, orange, yellow, and red bike signal, and it moves the cyclists differently at times than the cars. But Martin, do you have any thoughts about that for Lone Tree, and if that's even possible in your mind?
I'll offer a few comments, and then I'll turn it over to David, because I know he has a lot of knowledge about this as well. So there are really two different things. One, I think Mr. Spence is referencing a barns dance. I forget the actual technical term for it, but when all vehicle movement is stopped and pedestrians and bikes can go through the intersection, including crossways across it. So you don't have to cross two legs, you can go diagonally across it. They actually have one in downtown Prescott, and there exists in a number of other places. They work really, really well where you have pretty high volumes of peds and bikes who need to cross. It does add time to the signal, so it introduces delay for vehicles, and so there's kind of a trade-off. The other aspect of it that you mentioned, Council Member, is referred to as lead pedestrian intervals or lead bicycle intervals, where there's a specific part of the traffic signal for peds and bikes that gives them a head start over traffic. And I think that is actually under consideration for Lone Tree. Depending on how it's used, it can help mitigate certain types of crashes, including vehicles turning right into peds and bikes.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what Martin just said. He nailed it pretty well. The city, the MPO here, we wrote a grant for the city to help with technology deployment, including the kind of detection that's needed, video sensors and other things to pick up bikes and peds, so that this type of traffic signal timing can work better. And the partnership that is the MPO working with ADOT and others just recently is about to complete. ADOT is about to complete their Milton Corridor Master Plan, and a number of what were called spot improvements. We might have picked another moniker for that at the end, at a number of intersections. And Martin, maybe just kind of nod your head, talked about that kind of bicycle detection and bicycle infrastructure at the signals, which would be a big step forward. Again, it's a plan, no funding, but Jim Charlier, the author of much of the planning in this community, says there's money comes to plans faster than plans come to money. So sometimes it feels like all we're doing is planning, but those plans do bear fruit.
Sometimes. I was going to say, I think Martin touched upon it. The root issue that I've experienced working with our team at the city is that, and also with just folks in general, when we talk about planning and how we build, is we really prioritize and value the movement of cars and vehicles as a top priority and their efficiency to move through our networks over the health and safety and needs of bike and ped in those corridors. And that is a value that I'm challenging at the city and will continue to challenge. And I've learned that, again, in Portland and Eugene and other communities that have done a much better job at accommodating bike and ped, they flip that chart of priorities to put bike and ped at the top and then vehicles a lot closer to the bottom, really putting vehicles last. And I am asking that, the council discuss that at a future council meeting, hopefully in the months to come. So stay posted for that. That should be a great conversation. And if we can embrace a shift in priorities at our core, I think our projects will look a lot different in reflecting those priorities. Because currently we're prioritizing the movement of cars, hands down. And that's how it's been for, in my opinion, too long. But does anyone have anything they'd like to add to what I just said? I'd like to start wrapping it up. Claire, thank you for your support. This has been a journey that I've really dived into with our team, and I'm very excited about the progress we've made. But we have a long way to go, and we're just getting started. And so I'm excited because I think it's a policy discussion in regards to how we prioritize and what we value. And I'm looking forward to this council with the public engagement in making that decision. But really quick, as we start to wrap it up, I'll just mention to the public, your role in everything we're discussing tonight is critical and so important in holding us electeds accountable to your values and concerns. So please do engage with the city council. Please email us. There's an email address that reaches all of us. It's council@flagstaffaz.gov. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know your concerns. Check out the ATMP and engage in that public comment portion. And I'll go ahead and just let everyone know as well that I'm hosting a bicycle ride through our pilots this Sunday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And we're going to have a discussion following the bike ride. So meet me up on North Beaver on the west side of the street of the west side of FMC's campus in that parking lot area. And then we're going to cruise south down Beaver through Butler, back around, go up San Fran, and then stop at Heritage Square and have a conversation this Sunday at 10 a.m. Please do join us. But as we begin to wrap up, do folks have any closing comments that you'd like to share? I want to wrap up. It's almost been 2 hours of our time, but what a great discussion we've had.
I have a quick thing. Just to mention putting bicyclists and pedestrians first. If you look at the Flagstaff 2020, A Vision for Our Community document, that was one of the stated goals of that plan. And I think what you can take away from that, because as other folks spoke to, that was, to my knowledge, in recent decades, the biggest public engagement event that the city has undertaken. In terms of number of people engaged, children engaged, what they did to really make it a community effort. There was broad community support for that framework for transportation. And what there was not in that plan was a dedicated structural implementation of the plan. There were not, it was outside their purview to assign staff, to assign departments, to assign funding. That was not part of the plan. And I think that's been kind of an issue throughout these historic plans, is that the community support is there for bike paths, but the structures that would allow the city or the county or whoever it is to move forward, as well as the funding, which we know is always an issue, are not always in place and have not always been in place. And over the past 50 decades, that's changed. There are structures now like the Bicycle Commission or the committee, whatever it is, Bicycle Advisory Committee. Did I get it? Okay.
Uh-huh.
That's something that people were calling for starting in the 79 plan, just something of that sort, right? So I think, one, the community support has been there. There's evidence that it's been there the whole time. And now, the city may be at a point where the infrastructure is there to support actually making that vision a reality.
I love that. Martin, go ahead.
Adam, I would just broaden that concept. I think that, we talk about it in terms of are we prioritizing movement of vehicles or pedestrians and bicyclists? And actually, streets serve a lot more function than just simply movement. I mean, think about streets are our most ubiquitous community space, and they can serve as neighborhood gathering areas. They help define our community character and what our city looks like. And so, from that perspective, every time we think about transportation projects and street projects, our consideration should be drawn very broadly and across a whole wide range of community values and goals, including sustainability, environmental stewardship, neighborhood character, community character, as well as a movement of people and goods via transit, ped, bike, or vehicle.
Thank you for that. David, you want to go next?
I can't say it any better than Martin just did. That's absolutely right. And, there's plenty of work done and, that supports everything he just said in terms of if you take care of your streets and do them well, it does wonders for the community, and its mental health, its physical health, and just beauty and joy. So they're a great asset that we have abused.
I love that. Susan, take us home. Maybe
There
I
you
can
go.
help you. Okay.
I guess I will say build it and they will come. And that goes for cars that we don't want to come necessarily, and bicycles and peds that we do want to come. We know that if we make this city streets and trails comfortable for bicyclists, we could remove so many cars from the streets around Flagstaff and across the country. There are a few things as perfect as bicycling, in my opinion. It's fun. I never get in a car and start giggling just for the sheer joy of it, but I do it all the time when I'm on my bicycle. It feels good. It's good for me. It's good for anybody that does it. It releases the amount of asphalt you need in a city, the amount of parking, air pollution, codependency on foreign oil. I mean, there's just nothing more perfect than a bicycle. So we need to make sure everybody feels comfortable getting out on their bike in Flagstaff and then the world. Thank you.
That's great. Well, I want to close with this statement that's made in this Portland consultation piece that's in the description to this live stream. It says the 18 key projects recommended in the Central City in Motion increase the people moving capacity of their respective streets by an average of over 60%. And that's just massive, because that just tells us that there's really a shift that can really be done and can really enhance the longevity of our corridors. And I think that's what we're up against and the challenge that we're facing here in Flagstaff as we grow and evolve. So we need to do this again. I think that this was a great conversation. We'll have to have follow-ups. Sam, again, thank you so much for your expertise and your time today and sharing with us. We really appreciate it. And everyone on this panel, we so appreciate all of your hard work to better our community. And I appreciate your time this evening. Thank you all so much. Ride a bike. Join me this Sunday and engage in the city process. I've talked to too many folks who have said that they're tired of speaking up, but I'm asking you one more time to speak up and engage. We really need to hear your voices, and I think we really have an opportunity at hand. Thank you all again so much. Have a great rest of your evenings, and talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.